On the right bank of the Nile, a little downstream from Aswan, there is another man-made wonder of ancient Egypt, the picturesque temple of Kom Ombo. Some people might think it's just another set of ruins in a boring rural area surrounded by fields. But in fact, in antiquity, this temple was of great importance, because of its strategically advantageous position by the water. It served as a key stop for all caravans coming from Nubia, which is why it received its name, Kom Ombo, the Golden Hill. At the same time, this very location became fatal for the sanctuary, once the river changed its course and washed away the front part of the temple, and perhaps one day the water will take it all. Although most of the temple belongs to Greco-Roman period, like many similar structures, it was built on the site of an older temple, Ber Sobek, the house of the god Sobek. Cartouches of Thutmose III and Ramesses II were found here, which indicate its construction no later than the 15th century BCE. Under the Ptolemies, the temple acquired a unique new structure. It was turned into two parallel sanctuaries. One part was dedicated to Sobek, the crocodile-headed god, the other to Horus, the falcon-headed god. We already know Horus a little. As for Sobek, he was considered one of the most ancient gods of water and the Nile inundation. And although the fearsome look of a crocodile can be unsettling, Sobek was in fact a highly revered god of the Egyptian pantheon. Fishermen and hunters prayed to him in the reed thickets where they worked. He was asked to help the souls of the dead on their way to the kingdom of Osiris. Sobek influenced many spheres of life, and he was even called the one who listened the prayers, which made him unique among the gods of ancient Egypt. In many ways, the temple's layout resembles the temple of Hathor of Dendera or the temple of Isis on Philae, which we will visit later. The temple begins with a forecourt followed by a hypostyle hall, and in its holiest place there were two sanctuaries at once for both gods, and each had a divine bark on a granite pedestal. Near one of these pedestals there is a very small hutch. In antiquity, half-bent, a priest-prophet would sit there when some prophecy had to be delivered. Perhaps in this way the priests even deceived certain kings, since only the pharaohs and the highest priesthood had access to these rooms. On the northern wall on the hypostyle hall you can see Horus, presenting Ptolemy III with a sword of victory and the sign of eternal life. Right behind the pharaoh, one can make out the figure of his sister and wife, Cleopatra VII. And in the corridor that runs around the temple, there is one of the most famous reliefs. The priest of Pharaoh Necherhet-Djoser, Imhotep, proclaimed a god, presenting a king who kneels, probably from the Ptolemaic dynasty or a later period, with an entire set of medical instruments. Scalpels, bone saws, dental tools, over 2000 years old. We had to stare at the images for a long time before we finally found the astonishing relief. However, in my view, the greatest value of this temple lies in the fact that several ancient Egyptian calendars have been preserved here. They indicate on which days certain ritual festivals took place and which deity they were dedicated to. It was thanks to these calendars the Egyptologists were able to reconstruct important information. According to them, the annual cycle is embodied by a lioness-headed goddess, Renepet, also Sekhmet. Translated from ancient Egyptian, Renepet means year, which is why this goddess was often called the Lady of the Year, and it was believed that she governed all cycles of life. Don't be alarmed if the temple looks heavily ruined from the outside. In fact, inside there is splendid and extremely interesting reliefs, so we strongly recommend visiting this site. We are also very glad we managed to see this ancient wonder before the Nile finally takes it away from the land. We would like to believe the temple of Kom Ombo will stand for many more centuries. The great pharaoh Ramesses II, whose temples, reliefs and statues we have seen throughout our journey, left behind an enormous legacy. He erected thousands of his monuments along the Nile as far as Fourth Cataract, because he loved himself and did everything to demonstrate the sacred nature of his person. Nubia held a special place in Ramesses' politics, so he built 7 temples here. But one of the most impressive that had reached us is the Grand Abu Simbel, located almost on the border with Sudan. In antiquity it was called the Temple of Mecca, after the mountain into which this wonder was carved. It was built for about 25 years from the beginning of the king's reign. The work was incredibly difficult. 4 colossal 20-meter statues look out over the waters of the Nile, which at that time came almost right up to the temple. The Aswan Dam did not yet exist. Later the temple was moved and now it stands higher. The mount was created artificially. It is hollow inside and the dome is concrete. But let us imagine the temple in antiquity. Twice a year, in October and February, the sun rays traveling along the temple's 60 meters axis illuminated the cult statues of Amun-Ra, Lord of Thebes, the deified Ramesses, the sun god Ra-Horachti, and Ptah, who here symbolizes the transforming power of the earth, not the underworld as guides often claim. One popular legend says these dates are the day of Ramesses' coronation and birth. In fact, they are connected with solar festivals and the cult of the sun god. Above the entrance we see Ra-Horachti, whom Ramesses worships. But this is also a rebus in which his throne name is encoded. On the left User, mighty. On the right the figure of the goddess Ma'at. Together it reads User Ma'at Ra. One of the temple's main functions was the veneration of the Nile, so that the water would rise to a favorable height of 16 cubits, making the Egyptian land fertile without causing harm, whether by excessive flooding or by insufficient inundation that brought famine. Unfortunately, Abu Simbel did not become Ramesses' favorite temple, even though it was one of the most grand both outside and inside. Astonishing reliefs have survived here, telling of the king's military campaign, in particular the famous Battle of Kadesh. In that battle, Ramesses led his army and with incredible fury broke through the enemy encirclement that outnumbered his forces. The Egyptians were convinced that the chariot of Ramesses was guided by the god Amun himself. That is why on the main relief it appears that not one person stands of Ramesses' chariot, but 2. Behind him one can make out the ghostly figure of the god Amun. Why then did such a masterpiece fail to appeal to Ramesses? And why was it quickly neglected and covered by sand? There are at least 2 reasons. About 3 years before the work was completed, a terrible earthquake struck here. 2 colossi of Ramses fell, one inside the temple and one outside. The inner monument was restored, but the outer one, covered directly from the rock, could not be put back in place. Now imagine the whole temple painted and bright, and one of the colossi lying on the ground, exposing yellow sandy structure. For the ancient Egyptians, this likely looked horrifying and broke the harmony of the sanctuary. The second reason lies in the neighboring temple. There was a sacred mountain of Ipshek, within which there was a sanctuary of the goddess Hathor. It was here that Ramesses ordered the construction of a temple for his beloved wife Nefertari, whom he called the woman for whom the sun shines. Thankfully, this temple is wonderfully preserved, and even today it impresses with its beauty. Beautiful Nefertari is depicted here as a star Sirius, which made her divine even in life. In the center of the temple there is an ancient sanctuary adapted for the king's needs. In it the mother goddess Hathor emerges from a sacred grotto to bestow grace and eternal rebirth upon the soul of Ramesses and his wife. When Ramesses the Great sailed here with his court for the opening of these temples, his beloved wife Nefertari was with him. However, only a few months later documents appear recording her death. That means something tragic happened during the voyage, and on the return journey Ramesses came back alone, having lost his beloved. Perhaps this has also affected the fate of the temple, because Nefertari never lived to see the masterpiece created in her honor. The king's first encounter with this place coincided with the great loss. Florence Nightingale, who visited Abu Simbel in the 19th century, wrote, "Nowhere else is there such an enchanting place as Abu Simbel. You look abroad and see no tokens of habitation. The power of leaving the boat and running up to the temple at any hour of the day or night without a whole escort at your heels. The silence and stillness and freedom of it were what we shall never have again. Finally, we will tell you about another grand temple which was also rescued after the construction of the Aswan High Dam. For us, this temple has enormous significance, both for our journey and for the history of ancient Egypt. It was here that the great Egyptian culture created over millennia came to an end forever. The last texts in the sacred language of ancient Egypt, Medu Neter, were written on the walls of this temple, after which the language was forgotten. The temple we are in became the last stronghold of the priests who defended their culture to the end, despite all prohibitions. In an unequal struggle, Christians exterminated them all. Their mass graves are on a neighboring island, and people still honored them as a tribute to the devotion of the last Egyptian priests, as well as the Nubians who helped defend the temple. This temple was dedicated to the most revered among the ancient Egyptians, the great mother goddess Isis. Originally it stood on the island of Philae, which in antiquity was called Pa-Iurek, or Island of Time, like the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos by the will of the creator god. Today the island of Philae is permanently submerged by the waters of the Nile, and the temple stood in the water for several decades before it was moved to the higher island of Agilkia. But by that time, the magnificent colored reliefs, which had been beautifully preserved until the early 20th century, were destroyed. The green algae that has eaten into the sandstone walls are direct evidence of this. The lush vegetation that once turned the island into a true paradise vanished as well. The area now looks rather barren. Yet the majestic temple remains a real pearl of Nubia and rises proudly on an island in the middle of the Nile. The first structures here were built as early as the reign of Ramesses III in the 12th century BCE, and the temple stopped functioning in the 6th century CE, after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian established Christianity in Egypt. In these lands they are also revered Isis consort, Osiris. One of his tombs was located on the neighboring island of Abaton. In the temple's sacred sanctuary, you can see reliefs compositions telling how the goddess gathered together the parts of her murdered husband's body. And to the west of the temple, on Hadrian's Gate, there is a unique scene. The goddess watches a crocodile carrying Osiris' body out of the water. Magnificent hymns in honor of the goddess are also carved on the temple walls. Her sacred bark was kept here. Every 10 days it sailed to the sacred island of Abaton to perform rites of washing with water and milk at 365 altars of Osiris around his sacred tree, the cherret willow, believed to be the embodiment of his soul. On the portico of a small temple of the goddess of love Hathor, also located here, you can see captivating scenes with the dancing god Bes, musicians playing flutes and harps, and monkeys accompanying the dancers on lyres. The most striking structure on the island is the famous Pavilion of Trajan with 14 floral capitals. Who first called it a pavilion is hard to say, but its architectural lightness and elegance fully justify the name. There is an Arabic legend connected to one of the tales from 1001 Nights. It says that this graceful building was the bed of a pharaoh's daughter. Supposedly an unknown king locked a wifeful princess on this island. Meanwhile, her fiancé, a young man named Anas, overcame every obstacle in search of her. After the long trials, fate finally granted them happiness. Remaining faithful to one another, they escaped together to distant lands. Despite the great reverence for Isis, this place provoked envy and outrage among the priests of the temple of the ram-headed god Khnum from Elephantine. The reason is that the new, splendid, richly decorated temple, built under Greco-Roman rules, completely eclipsed the temple of their god. Due to the lack of donations and funding, the temple quickly declined, though once it had been a deeply revered sanctuary. Even Djoser, the king of the Third Dynasty, for whom the first pyramid was built, came here with rich offerings to Khnum after a 7-year famine struck the country. After his sincere prayers, the Nile rose twice, bringing the people a generous harvest and protecting them from further misfortune. But new kings did not listen to the priests' pleas. Instead, they began bringing sacrifices to Khnum inside the temple of Isis. Perhaps political motives played a role here, because temples that supported Egyptian claimants to the throne and took part in uprising against foreign rulers usually faced harsh repression. The fact that the older sanctuary was neglected and deliberately abandoned, while a new one was built in its place, is direct evidence of this. Just a few years ago, the floodplains behind the island were home to the Aswan crocodile, the only known crocodile living below the high dam. A German tourist bought it as a hatchling in Cairo and released it into the Nile near Aswan. It was generally believed to be a rather happy creature. It was basking the sun on a rock, then hide in the water, waiting for the fish to swim straight into his jaws. Unfortunately, during our visit, we did not see this crocodile. After returning to Aswan, I sat for a long time on the terrace of our home, looking into a distance at the felucca sailing past, and trying to make sense of everything I had seen on our journey. At some point by moonlight, it seemed to me that I could see a sacred procession in distance with torches. People proudly carried golden barks with sculpted statues of the gods through a joyful crowd. I saw the pharaoh's flotilla slowly drifting by on painted ships, their prows decorated with images of gods crowned with huge solar discs between their horns. The pharaoh was heading to the ancient temples of his heavenly father and all his kin to honor them, to bring in offerings, water, wine, bread, and all kinds of food, and to ask for a new Nile inundation that would ensure the prosperity of all Egypt. I almost sensed the smell of frankincense and myrrh as a fit for a hold. The gods are here, among people. They hear everything, see everything, but act according to some plan of their own that sooner or later will bring grace and grant immortality. I watched and watched until the vision vanished. Everything fell silent. The music and singing no longer sounded. In the moonlight, my mother asked what I was thinking about. I didn't answer. I hated to lose the vision my imagination had unfolded in the magical colors of night. Now before me there was only the low sky with its starry canopy and the lonely, not yet full moon. Ancient Egyptian culture died. It was confirmed by the voice of the owl we heard 3 times. It moved silently from place to place, and in Egyptian beliefs the owl symbolizes death. Large bats circled without a sound, and jackals howled in the necropolis at the edge of the desert, reminding us of mortality. Ancient Egypt died. But even in death it remained majestic, like its god Osiris who was reborn into eternal life. In the city of Sais, in the temple of the goddess Neith, there stood an ancient statue symbolizing old Takemet. On it was carved, "I am all that is, I am all that was, I am all that will be." Because the legacy of this extraordinary civilization is still here. It lives in everything around us. It lives in us. And whatever sphere of modern life we take, if we dig deeper, sooner or later we will come back to ancient Egypt. Dear friends, our journey through historical Egypt is coming to an end. Tomorrow we head north, and from there we will travel to Sharm el-Sheikh to spend the rest of our holiday resting and trying to proceed the entire mass of information we have received on this trip. That is why we sincerely recommended that when you come to Egypt, you don't get stuck at provincial resorts. Because if you sit in the hotel or go to excursions where you are led around like sheep on a rope in the guide's hand, you won't see the real Egypt and you won't feel its atmosphere. Don't be afraid to travel. Get on a bus, a train, a plane, and set off on a grand adventure across this astonishing country. Absorb it, understand it, and then Egypt will reveal itself to you in a completely different, sacred light. And now we say goodbye, and we wish you warmth and comfort in your home this winter. See you again soon, friends!